Hi everyone, I'm Yariv. I'll be entertaining you during your break. So I'll be talking about autofocus or autofocus for AR and VR. That's my 13th birthday present. I was very excited when I got it. Just tells you how old I am, I guess. And I went immediately and took pictures with it, only to realize a few weeks later, because I had to have it developed and printed, that most of it was out of focus, especially the interesting parts. And it was only when autofocus cameras or focusing cameras arrived that we were able to shoot what we wanted to shoot and not what the camera decided that we should be able to capture. And so with this analogy, I want to address an issue in AR and VR currently that I think Ryan just mentioned before about the fact that we have one focal plane in AR and VR systems today. So let's assume that we're looking at this scene and we have an AR set on our heads. And now we see this guy appears. This is a virtual character, obviously. And he seems a bit out of focus, right? But the fact is that we expect this character to be in focus when we are focused on the bottle. We could actually focus to this character. And when we do that, the background gets into focus, but the bottle is out of focus. And the reason for that is because most AR sets, or actually all of the AR and VR sets that we see today, have a fixed focal plane, and that would usually be at a far distance. Some of them may be at 1 meter, 2 meters, and some of them may be at infinity or a very far distance. But it will always be at a fixed focal plane. And so if you want to have a real immersive experience and see that virtual character in focus, you probably won't be able to do that today. So I'm going to be a little bit technical here, but after the previous talk, that may be easier work for me. And I will talk a little bit about what happens in our eye when we experience AR and VR. So the lens that says autofocusing lens is the relevant element in our eye that is causing part of this problem. The entire problem is caused by our entire vision system, but the lens itself is the one that I'm going to be talking about now. So as you heard in the previous talk, when we're looking at a far object the rays coming into our eye through that lens are seemingly parallel. They're almost parallel. So there are no angles between these rays, okay? And this is exactly the kind of ray differences that we would expect if something is at different distances. But once we're looking at an object that's far away, all the light coming in looks like it's coming in parallel rays. And so the lens that you see here with the arrows going outwards, the lens is literally doing its minimal work. You'll see in the next slide, because I don't see here how I can go back to, oh, is this going back? Yeah, that's simple. Okay. So if we're looking at a closer object, you'll see that the light's rays are coming in different angles. And you'll notice if I go back and forth, you'll see that the lens is reshaping to do a stronger optical work. So that still the image that we get on our retina is sharp. If that didn't work, we'd get a blurry image. So for far distance, the lens would be relatively relaxed. And then for close distance, the lens would converge or would be denser and thicker and do more substantial optical work to focus the light. Now, what happens with AR and VR? We're looking at a virtual object, and that virtual object is apparently not very far away from us. But the thing is that AR and VR headsets have a single source of light. And that single source of light, as I said before, is usually projecting light as if it's coming from infinity, as if it's coming from a far distance, or at least relatively far distance. Some of them may be at 2 meters or something like that, but that's relatively far. So the light rays are actually coming in parallel as if the object was far away, while the virtual object seems to us, because of this stereoscopic effect or other trick that is being done on our minds, we think that this is actually closer. So if we look at what's happening in our eye, we see the virtual object, and then our vision system controlling our lens is controlling our lens to go thicker and to focus to this close object. But as said, the rays are coming in from a far distance, or virtually far distance. And so what we get is a blurry image, okay? Because the lens is expecting light to be coming in different angles, but the angles of the light are actually parallel. And so we're getting a blurred image. This has many names and has many references. The most known one, I think, is the vergence-accommodation conflict. And this is the accommodation conflict. The accommodation is what the lens, inner lens is doing. It's accommodating to a close object, but it's actually blurring the image because the light is not coming from a close object. So here's what we want to do. In this case, it says deep optics lens, but you could put any lens here to actually change the rays angle so as to match the real distance of the object. If we could reshape the phase of the light, the angles of the rays, we could then fit to the perceptive accommodation of the lens and get the sharp image. So that was the physiological explanation or preview to why we have the problem, what is the problem, and what we're trying to solve. And clearly, if we want to go back to the analogy from the cameras, we could go back to here AR and VR. We're clearly at the stage of fixed focus AR and VR systems, and we want to move forward to a dynamic or autofocus AR and VR systems. And for that, we need a tunable lens or tunable optics capability. We at Deep Optics, we're developing liquid crystal lenses, and so this is one approach of implementing tunable lenses. And this approach is providing most of what AR and VR need, which is to be transparent with no moving parts, support large field of view, not much form factor and weight, and everything you see here written. Response time should be fast. Everything is nice, except liquid crystal lenses are limited in their, I would say, optical budget or optical performance overall. And the key trade-off would normally be between the optical power, meaning how strong the lens could be. Can it be 1 diopter, 2 diopter, etc.? And then what is the field of view that can be supported? The short story is that you cannot have both. You cannot have the 2, 3 diopters that you need to cover close range to far distance, and also 30, 40, 50 millimeters of size or aperture of the lens to support the required field of view for AR and VR headsets. What we do in Deep Optics is we implemented liquid crystal lenses in a pixelated manner. So that means that we can draw or implement a virtual aperture or effective aperture, dynamic aperture, on a big panel. So, for example, we could take a 100 by 100 millimeter panel, which is significantly larger than any field of view required for any of these devices, and just dynamically determine where we want to implement the aperture of that lens. So this is, for example, 3 examples where if you see a very saturated spot, that would be a strong lens. If you see a relatively transparent spot, that would be a more weaker, let's say 1 diopter and 3 diopters, and then we can also position it. So what this effectively allows us to do is to really draw or implement the lens, obviously combined with some tracking system inside the device, to really position the lens in front of the gaze. Okay? So if the object is moving and the eye is tracking it, and the lens is integrated into the HMD, we can just position the lens right in front of it, and effectively, from the user's perspective, they have a full field of view lens, always focusing to the right distance. This is a video, so I don't know if I can operate it from here. Is it maybe possible to, yeah. So what we see here is an example taken by a camera through our lens that focuses. Can we repeat that, maybe? Thank you. We can see 2 areas of the lens being focused alternatively to focus to the right distance of that plane. And that's allowing us to get to the result we wanted. We wanted to calibrate or control the focal plane of that virtual character so as to match the virtual distance of the character, and then to match the real distance of the real object. We can see them both in focus simultaneously. That's it. Thank you. Current models, we can do 100 milliseconds.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Excuse me?
Just repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was how fast the lens can change between different modes or different positions. Currently, we can do 100 milliseconds. This can also be traded off with the aperture size. So if we're going for smaller apertures, we can reduce it significantly to around 20, maybe 10 milliseconds as well.
Anybody else have any questions? If you have questions, punch them into the Slide.io app and put in the, while we have this question, if you have another question, please put it into the app so that we can get them up on the screen.
100 milliseconds would be really hard for VR and AR, right? Because it requires 20 and the 20 millisecond latency.
Right. So, oh, okay. Now I see. Yeah, this is a good point. I haven't seen so far VR system or AR system that does it in 100 milliseconds or 10 milliseconds. So the assumption that the refresh rate of the display should match the refresh rate of the focal plane, I'm not sure about this assumption, because eventually our accommodation system, the speed that we're focusing, is approximately 300 milliseconds. So it takes us significantly longer to change our accommodation when we're looking at something than it would take to the lens, okay? So by the time we would mess up the image, as I showed in the first part of the presentation, the lens would already be ready with the right fix. But then yes, I assume that it would be better if it's faster and always reflects the right depth of the object. And so I think it's certainly better to have something working at 100 milliseconds than having nothing at all. And then obviously once it gets faster, it would be an improvement. But my assumption is that it's probably better to use a 100 millisecond in AR and VR than have nothing at all there. How are you planning on applying this tech to current hardware? The way we do it is we collaborate with the AR and VR makers, and we provide the panels, the lenses, with a very simple API that simply says, apply this diopter at this position with this size of aperture, 2 lenses to any such kit, and they can come in many sizes and fit the right AR or VR devices of whoever is making them. So we're not going to manufacture, distribute consumer products. We're doing a component that should integrate into existing or new generation of existing AR/VR sets. What is the difference between your tech and Oculus SLM tech? Oculus, I'm assuming you're talking about the paper that was published in recently, like a month or so ago. Is this it? What we do is also, I mean, we do a special light modulator. Okay, that's what we do. And I think what Oculus published is a way to use SLM to realize holographic display. So I'm not sure these are contradicting. I think these are complementary. So if Oculus are developing their own SLM, then I don't know what it is, and I don't know what are the differences. But what I understood from this paper is that it's actually describing how you could use SLM to realize holographic displays. And as an example, you could be using deep optics liquid crystal lens as this SLM in the system.
I think you could see there's a Microsoft paper and an Oculus paper that are a bit different. The Oculus one's a focal surface.
That's right. I'm talking about this one, the Oculus one. But it assumes that there is an SLM in the system to realize this perspective, this holographic. Is the deep optic system dependent on eye tracking? And if so, are you developing eye tracking devices? That's a tricky question. We are developing eye tracking, but we're not offering it as part of this solution. We're developing eye tracking for a different application, which is vision correction glasses, not AR or VR. But then the way we see it, eye tracking is probably going to be included in most next generation AR and VR systems, and they're probably going to be responsible for several tasks, not only to support the positional lens. So eye tracking is not part of the offering that we have in this case. Is it dependent on it? It's not dependent on it. It can leverage from it. So in that sense, we do have an implementation of our lenses without moving their centers. If you want to move the lenses around, you could do that, and you could do that depending on input from an eye tracker, or you could just assume it from the content. For example, if you know that the object is at a certain angle, you could just position the lens there without eye tracking because you're controlling the content as well. How does the system work when it's on someplace more objects? Okay. So yeah, that's an important point. We have a single focal plane. Okay, so you could look at it, this solution as being somewhere in the middle between a holographic display and the current static focal plane. So you have currently a static focal plane. What we're saying is that you could have it dynamic. You'd move it around, but it would still be a plane. It would not be multiple depths in the same frame. Combined with the fact that we're looking at a specific object, it probably means that if you're looking at an object, it would get into focus. Because our eye is usually focused at a single focal plane in any case. What is the lens array density today? It's not a lens array, it's an array of pixels, but eventually it's a single lens. So it's like having a lens of glasses. There's no significance in terms of its resolution. The resolution of the pixels inside is something that we determine in order to get good accuracy of the approximation of the light modulation, but not something that the eye would identify. These are significantly smaller pixels than the eye can see, not to mention the fact that it's 2 centimeters away from our eye, so we cannot see it at all. How's the transparency of the LCD? Currently, this is a challenge for us. We currently have around 80% transparency. We're targeting around 95% transparency. What is the largest diameter that could be made if the FOV of the system is 50 degrees? So as I mentioned, virtually it can be any FOV. So the diameter is the real-time diameter. What I mean is when we select a specific lens, when we decide we want to do a 1 diopter or 2 diopter, there is a trade-off between how large it is and what the power would be. So we can do approximately 4 diopters in 20 millimeters, okay? We could do more, but then the quality of the periphery would not be as good. We could do less and maybe do a faster lens and so on. But the 50-degree, that can be any number because, like I said before, effectively we could move this 20-millimeter aperture around to do 50 degrees or 100 degrees or whatever. Is this answering the question or? Hopefully. Is that system also usable for waveguide display in AR? Yeah, definitely. We're actually demonstrating it at our booth with waveguide display of Loomis's AR system. So at least this is something you can check for yourselves.
All right, very good. Any other questions from the gallery? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So